It started with the scent of cinnamon, not the warm, welcoming kind that usually filled our kitchen when Laura baked her apple crumble, but a sharper, more exotic spice clinging faintly to her coat one Tuesday evening. She'd been late, citing a last-minute snag at the library where she volunteered, something about cataloging a new donation. It was plausible, entirely plausible, yet the scent felt misplaced, like a single wrong note in a familiar melody. I commented on it, sniffing the air theatrically as she hung her coat in the hall. "Trying out a new perfume, love?" She paused, her back to me, before turning with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, this old thing? Must be from that potpourri bowl at the front desk. Overpowering, isn't it?" She brushed past me towards the kitchen, changing the subject to dinner, and I let it go. Or rather, I tried to. But the scent lingered, not just on her coat, but in my mind, a tiny burr caught in the fabric of our comfortable, predictable life. We'd been married 38 years, Arthur and Laura. It felt like a single entity sometimes, a name etched onto wedding invitations, Christmas cards, the deed to the house where we'd raised our 2 children, now grown with lives of their own. I was 63, recently retired from a career teaching history, enjoying the slower pace, the long walks, the time to finally read all the books I'd collected. Laura, a year younger, seemed restless, filling her days with volunteer work, her book club, a newly joined gardening society. I'd attributed her energy to newfound freedom, a chance to pursue interests she'd set aside while juggling work and family. I admired her spirit, truly. But lately, beneath the hum of her activity, there was a subtle dissonance, a quiet withdrawal I couldn't quite pinpoint. It wasn't just the cinnamon scent. There were other things, small shifts in routine easily explained away on their own, but unsettling when viewed together. The book club meetings that stretched later into the evening, often ending with her arriving home flushed and slightly breathless, smelling faintly of wine I didn't recognize. Her phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, now seemed permanently attached to her hand or tucked away in her purse, always screened down. When it rang, she'd often glance at the caller ID before letting it go to voicemail or stepping into another room to take the call, her voice lowered to a murmur. "Just Janet, fussing about the garden, Rhoda," she'd say breezily upon returning, or "Spam call, honestly, they're relentless." And I'd nod, accepting the explanation, because questioning it felt disloyal, accusatory. This was Laura, my Laura, the woman who knew how I took my coffee, who could finish my sentences, whose hand fit perfectly in mine as we walked down the street. To doubt her felt like doubting the foundations of my own life. Yet the doubts persisted, quiet whispers in the back of my mind. There was the time I'd picked up her dry cleaning and found a receipt tucked in the pocket of her raincoat for a coffee shop across town, dated during a time she was supposedly at a library board meeting downtown. "Oh, weird," she'd said when I casually mentioned it, waving a dismissive hand. "Maybe I grabbed the wrong coat that day?" Another plausible explanation, another burr added to the collection. I started noticing her appearance more, not in a critical way, but objectively. She'd always taken care of herself, but there was a renewed attention to detail. New hairstyles, brighter scarves, a subtle but definite upgrade in her wardrobe. She glowed, and while a part of me was pleased to see her looking so vibrant, another, smaller part felt a cold prickle of unease. Was this vibrancy for me, or was it directed elsewhere? The physical side of our marriage had quieted over the years, settling into a comfortable companionship more than youthful passion. It was a natural progression, I'd thought, born of familiarity and the gentle erosion of time. But her recent excuses for avoiding intimacy felt different, less about genuine tiredness, more like polite deflections. A hand gently removing mine from her shoulder, a quick kiss on the cheek before turning over, the space between us in the bed seeming wider than before. I tried to rationalize it. Midlife changes, perhaps? Stress? A desire for more independence now that the children were gone and I was retired? I suggested a weekend away, just the two of us, hoping to reconnect. She agreed, but without the enthusiasm I'd hoped for, and then canceled at the last minute. A sudden, unavoidable commitment with the gardening society. Disappointment warred with a growing sense of dread. The turning point wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no single catastrophic revelation. It was quieter, almost mundane, which somehow made it worse. I was searching for an old tax document in the filing cabinet in our shared home office. Laura was out. Another gardening society meeting. Tucked away at the very back of the drawer, behind files decades old, was a slim, unmarked folder I didn't recognize. Curiosity, tinged with a guilt I couldn't suppress, made me open it. Inside wasn't incriminating evidence in the traditional sense. No letters, no photographs, just receipts. Dozens of them, neatly compiled over the past 6 months. Receipts for dinners at restaurants we'd never visited together, always for two. Receipts for flowers delivered to an address I didn't know. Receipts for small, thoughtful gifts, a silk scarf I hadn't seen, a bottle of expensive cologne that wasn't mine. And then, tucked near the bottom, 3 receipts from a boutique hotel on the far side of the city, each for a one-night stay, midweek. I stood there, the papers trembling slightly in my hand. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, cold. Each receipt was a small, sharp stab, dismantling the reality I had clung to. The cinnamon scent, the late meetings, the phone calls, the distance. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. It wasn't stress or a midlife crisis or newfound independence. It was betrayal, methodical, calculated, hidden away in the back of a filing cabinet. My first instinct was denial's last gasp. Perhaps they were old, from a business trip she'd taken years ago. But the dates were recent, stretching back over the autumn and winter months. There was no mistaking it, no plausible explanation left. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The familiar objects in the room, the worn leather chair, the overflowing bookshelves, the framed photos of our smiling children, suddenly alien. I sank into the chair, the receipts fanned out on the desk before me, a mosaic of deceit. There was no rage, not yet, just a profound hollow ache spreading through my chest, stealing my breath. The silence of the house pressed in, amplifying the frantic pounding in my ears. Laura, my Laura, how could this be real? How long had I been living in this carefully constructed illusion while she lived another life entirely? The scent of cinnamon seemed to fill the room again, sharp and suffocating. I carefully placed the receipts back in the folder, slid it precisely back where I'd found it, and closed the drawer. My movements were automatic, detached, as if observing someone else perform these actions. Touching the evidence felt like handling something contaminated, something that could infect the remaining fragments of normalcy. I walked out of the office, closing the door softly behind me, and stood in the hallway, listening to the ticking grandfather clock in the living room measure out the seconds of my altered reality. What now? Confront her? Demand answers? The thought sent a wave of nausea through me, imagining the conversation, the potential lies, the justifications, the carefully rehearsed apologies, or perhaps the cold indifference, felt unbearable. A part of me, the part that had spent nearly 4 decades building a life around this woman, wanted to unsee what I'd seen, to rewind time to that morning when the world still felt solid and predictable. But the knowledge was there, lodged like a shard of glass in my heart. Every shared glance, every casual touch, every conversation from the past 6 months replayed in my mind, now filtered through the harsh lens of betrayal. Her laughter seemed brittle, her smiles manufactured, her reassurances hollow. Had any of it been real? Had I been blind, willingly or otherwise? The shame of that possibility was almost as painful as the infidelity itself. I went into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, my hands moving through the familiar ritual with a steadiness that surprised me. The warmth of the mug was a small comfort against the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the garden Laura tended with such care, the budding roses, the neatly pruned hedges. It looked peaceful, orderly, a stark contrast to the chaos churning inside me. When I heard her car pull into the driveway an hour later, my heart leaped into my throat. I stayed seated, gripping the mug, bracing myself. She came in humming, shedding her coat, her cheeks pink from the spring air. "Arthur, you won't believe the drama over the tulip bulbs," she began, stopping short when she saw my face. Her smile faltered. "Everything all right, love? You look pale." I met her gaze, searching her familiar features for some sign, some flicker of the truth I now knew. But her expression was open, concerned, perhaps a little wary of my silence. Years of habit, of trusting her, warred with the cold certainty the receipts had brought. "Just tired," I managed, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "Long day." She accepted it, though a line of worry creased her brow. She bustled around the kitchen, starting dinner preparations, her movements filling the silence I couldn't seem to break. I watched her chop vegetables, her hands sure and steady, the familiar rhythm of her presence both a comfort and a torment. How could she act so normal? How could she stand there, talking about tulips and dinner plans, knowing what she knew, knowing what I might know? Or did she assume I was still blissfully unaware, safely cocooned in the life she presented to me? That evening passed in a haze of forced normalcy. We ate dinner, discussed mundane topics, a leaky faucet, a call from our daughter. I responded in monosyllables, retreated behind a facade of weariness. Laura grew quieter too, occasionally casting me sideways glances, likely sensing the unusual tension, but perhaps attributing it to my moodiness. We watched television, sitting side by side on the sofa, the physical proximity a cruel mockery of the chasm that had opened between us. I felt her arm brush against mine and resisted the urge to flinch. Later, in bed, the silence was thick, suffocating. I lay awake long after her breathing evened out into sleep, staring at the ceiling, the patterns in the plaster seeming to shift and morph in the darkness. The receipts, the dates, The locations played on a loop in my mind. Who was he? Was it someone I knew? How had it started? Why, the questions were relentless, hammering against the inside of my skull, but the answers remained elusive, shrouded in Laura's secrecy. Sleep offered no escape. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were fragmented, unsettling. Images of cinnamon sticks turning into snakes, familiar paths leading to dead ends, Laura's face smiling from a distance I couldn't cross. I woke hours before dawn, the sheets damp, my heart pounding with a nameless anxiety. The other side of the bed was empty. Laura was already up. I found her downstairs, sitting in the pre-dawn gloom of the living room, a half-empty teacup on the table beside her. She wasn't reading or looking out the window, just sitting, staring into space. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She shook her head. "Thinking." "About?" The question hung in the air, heavier than I intended. She hesitated, tracing the rim of her cup. "Us. You seemed off yesterday. Distant." Here it was, an opening, a chance to lay the folder on the table, to demand the truth. But the words wouldn't come. Fear held them captive. Fear of the answers, fear of the finality, fear of shattering the fragile peace, however illusory it might be. "Just tired, Laura," I repeated, the lie tasting like ash. "Retirement takes some adjusting to, I suppose." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. "Maybe we should go away after all," she suggested quietly. "That weekend trip, just us. Reconnect." The irony was bitter. Reconnect? How could we reconnect across the chasm of her deceit? Yet her suggestion, the faint hope in her voice, snagged on something within me. Was it possible? Could this be salvaged? Could we find our way back from this precipice? Or was she merely trying to shore up the facade, sensing cracks in my obliviousness? I didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch again. The first hint of dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky, casting long, pale shadows across the room. The house was still, holding its breath. I looked at Laura, my wife of nearly 4 decades, the mother of my children, the woman I had loved more than life itself. And for the first time, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. The path forward was shrouded in fog, terrifyingly unclear. Staying silent felt like complicity, yet speaking the truth felt like detonating a bomb in the foundations of our lives. The receipts in the folder upstairs felt like dead weights, pulling me down. "All right," I heard myself say, the word sounding foreign. "Let's go away, that weekend." Laura looked relieved, a genuine smile finally touching her eyes. "Oh, Arthur, that's wonderful. It'll do us good, just like old times." Old times. The phrase hung there, mocking me. There were no old times anymore, only the time before I knew and the time after. But I nodded, forcing a semblance of agreement. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps away from the house, away from the routines and the hidden folder, things would become clearer. Or perhaps it would simply provide the sterile ground I needed for the conversation I dreaded, but knew was inevitable. We spent the next few days in a state of suspended animation. Laura threw herself into planning the trip, booking a quaint inn by the coast we hadn't visited in years, researching restaurants, talking about scenic drives. Her cheerfulness felt frantic, almost desperate, as if she could paper over the cracks in our life with enough enthusiasm. I played along, packing my bag, making the appropriate noises of anticipation, but inside I felt like an imposter. Every interaction was strained, every shared meal eaten under the shadow of my discovery. The receipts were a physical presence between us, unseen but palpable. The drive to the coast was mostly silent. Laura tried to initiate conversation a few times, pointing out landmarks, recalling anecdotes from previous trips. I responded politely, but briefly, my mind elsewhere, rehearsing words I couldn't bring myself to say. The sea air hit us as we got out of the car at the inn, sharp and clean, carrying the cries of gulls. It felt cleansing, hopeful, and for a fleeting moment I wondered if I could simply choose ignorance again, choose to believe the performance Laura was staging. The inn was charming, just as she'd described, with sloping floors and window seats overlooking the churning gray water. We checked in, unpacked, the forced intimacy of the small room amplifying the tension. That evening we walked along the beach as the tide went out, the wet sand reflecting the fading light. Laura slipped her arm through mine, a gesture so familiar it almost felt comforting. Almost. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" she murmured, leaning her head against my shoulder for a moment. "Remember that time we came here with the kids? Chloe was so determined to find a starfish." I remembered. I remembered everything about our life together, vividly. That was the agony of it. The memories weren't tainted, but they were now overlaid with a sickening filter of deceit. "I remember," I said quietly. We ate dinner at a small seafood restaurant overlooking the harbor. The food was excellent, the wine crisp, but I tasted none of it. Laura kept the conversation flowing, talking about the garden, her book club friends, Olivia, Janet, her voice light, almost carefree. I watched her across the table, the soft candlelight catching the silver threads in her hair, the familiar curve of her smile, and the question burned inside me, how? How could you sit here acting as if nothing has happened, as if our entire life isn't balanced on the edge of a knife? Back in our room, the pretense finally became unbearable. Laura was getting ready for bed, humming softly as she brushed her hair. I stood by the window, looking out at the dark, restless sea. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore seemed to echo the turmoil inside me. "Laura," I said, my voice low, rough. She stopped humming, turning to face me, her expression questioning. "Yes?" I turned from the window, my heart pounding against my ribs. I hadn't planned this, hadn't rehearsed these specific words, but they came anyway, flat and heavy. "The folder, in the office filing cabinet, behind the old tax returns." Her face went utterly still. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin almost translucent in the lamplight. Her eyes widened slightly, not in confusion, but in stark, dawning recognition. The hairbrush slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor. We both stared at it for a moment, the small sound enormous in the sudden, absolute silence. She didn't deny it, didn't ask what folder, didn't pretend. Her shoulders slumped, a slow, visible deflation, as if the strings holding her upright had been cut. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice barely audible, thick with tears she didn't shed. I didn't know how to tell you." The simplicity of her admission, the lack of defense, was almost more shocking than denial would have been. All the anger I had anticipated, the righteous fury, seemed to evaporate, leaving behind only a vast, aching emptiness. "How long?" I asked, the question devoid of heat, just a need for the factual landscape of my own life. She hesitated, then whispered, "About 8 months." 8 months of lies, 8 months of shared meals, conversations, touches, all under the shadow of this other life she was living. 8 months of receipts meticulously filed away. "The hotel receipts," I stated, not needing to phrase it as a question. She nodded mutely, her hands twisting in her lap. "Who is he?" The question felt necessary, clinical. She shook her head, finally looking up, her eyes pleading. "Does it matter, Arthur? It wasn't about him, not really. It was about—" She trailed off, searching for words that couldn't possibly justify the betrayal. "About feeling lost, feeling unseen." Unseen? The irony was staggering. I had seen her, perhaps more clearly than she knew. I had seen her vibrancy, her restlessness, her late nights, her guarded phone calls. I had seen the cinnamon scent clinging to her coat. I just hadn't allowed myself to understand what I was seeing. "So, you found someone who saw you," I said, the words tasting like rust. "At restaurants we never went to, in hotel rooms across the city." She flinched, tears finally spilling over, tracking paths down her pale cheeks. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "Arthur, I am so sorry." Sorry. The word felt inadequate, meaningless. It couldn't rebuild the shattered trust, couldn't erase the image of the receipts, couldn't undo the months of calculated deception. I looked at her, the woman I had shared my life with, and felt a profound sense of disconnection. The love was still there, a deep residual ache, but it was tangled inextricably with the pain of her betrayal. Forgiveness felt impossible, reconciliation unthinkable. "I don't think sorry covers it, Laura," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The hollowness inside me was solidifying into a grim resolve. I think this is where it ends." Her head snapped up, fresh tears welling. "No, Arthur, please, we can fix this. I'll end it with him. We can go to counseling. We can—" "Can we?" I interrupted, the question hanging heavy between us. "Can we go back? Can I unknow what I know? Can I ever look at you again without seeing those receipts, without wondering?" I shook my head slowly, the movement feeling final. "I don't think so." I walked over to my suitcase, opened it, and began methodically placing my folded clothes back inside. Each movement felt deliberate, weighted. "What are you doing?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "I'm leaving," I said, not looking at her. "I'll stay at a hotel tonight. We can talk about arrangements when I get back to the house tomorrow, but not as husband and wife." She started to sob then, deep, ragged breaths that tore at the silence. Part of me, the part conditioned by decades of partnership, wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but I couldn't. That bridge had been burned. I closed the suitcase, the click of the latches echoing in the room. I picked it up, walked to the door, and paused, my hand on the knob. I didn't look back. "I hope," I said, the words scraped raw from my throat, "that whoever he is, I hope he was worth it." Then I opened the door and walked out, leaving behind the ruins of our 38 years. The sea air felt cold against my face as I stepped out into the night, the rhythmic crash of the waves, a somber soundtrack to the first steps of a future I had never imagined, a future I now had to build alone. The pain was immense, a physical weight in my chest, but beneath it there was also a flicker, faint but distinct, of release. The pretending was over. The ground, though shattered, was finally solid beneath my feet. I didn't know where the path led, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was the one choosing the direction. The walk from the room to the car felt miles long, each step echoing on the gravel path. The inn, moments before a symbol of forced reconciliation, now seemed like a stage set for a play I'd abruptly walked out of. I didn't look back towards our window. I couldn't. The car started with a familiar rumble, a sound that usually meant heading home together. Tonight, it just underscored my solitude. Pulling out of the small parking lot onto the dark coastal road, the headlights cut a lonely swathe through the night. The rhythmic sweep of the wipers cleared away a light drizzle that had started, mimicking the tears Laura had shed, tears that felt both genuine and utterly inadequate. My mind was a chaotic whirl. Fragments of the confrontation replayed, the clatter of the hairbrush, the look on Laura's face, her whispered confession, my own cold words of departure. There was no satisfaction in having the truth, only the desolate confirmation of my deepest fears. The questions I hadn't asked hammered at me. Who was he? Was it someone I knew from the library board? Someone from her past? Did our children know? The thought sent a fresh stab of pain through me. No, Laura wouldn't have burdened them, would she? But then I wouldn't have thought she could weave such an intricate web of deceit either. The drive back took hours, passing through sleeping towns and stretches of empty highway. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was preferable to any music or chatter. It matched the vast emptiness that had opened up inside me. I thought about the folder of receipts again, the cold, hard evidence. Feeling unseen, she'd said. Had I made her feel unseen? Had I become complacent, buried in my books and retirement routines, taking her presence for granted? The guilt gnawed at me, a familiar reflex honed over years of partnership, finding fault in myself to explain her actions. But it felt different this time. Even if I had failed her in some ways, did it justify the lies, the meticulous planning, the affair itself? No, nothing could justify that level of betrayal. I considered calling my daughter, Chloe. Just hearing her voice might anchor me, but what would I say? How could I drop this bomb into her life over the phone in the middle of the night? No, that conversation needed to happen face to face, when I had a clearer head, when I knew what the next steps even looked like. Instead of heading straight home, the thought of walking into that house, our house, alone, was unbearable. I took the exit for a nondescript chain hotel near the motorway. Checking in felt surreal. The night clerk barely looked up as he took my details. "Just one night?" he asked automatically. "Yes," I replied, the single word feeling momentous. Just one night. The first night of the rest of my life separate from Laura. The hotel room was sterile, impersonal, beige walls, generic art, the faint smell of disinfectant. It was the opposite of the cozy clutter of our home, the opposite of the seaside inn's forced charm. It was neutral territory, and right now that felt like a blessing. I dropped my suitcase by the door and sank onto the edge of the too-firm bed. The silence here was different from the silence in the car, flatter, emptier. I didn't sleep. I watched the digital clock on the bedside table flip minute by minute. 2:17 a.m., 3:48 a.m., 4:55 a.m. Each passing minute felt like a small step away from the life I knew. Images flashed through my mind, Laura laughing on our wedding day, holding Chloe for the first time, the two of us waving goodbye as our son left for university, quiet evenings reading side by side, decades of shared history, now fractured. Was it all a lie? Or just the last 8 months? Could love and betrayal coexist in the same heart, the same marriage? As dawn began to break, painting the sky outside the hotel window in shades of gray and faint pink, a different feeling began to emerge alongside the grief. It was clarity, cold, hard, unwelcome clarity. The marriage I had cherished, the partnership I thought was solid, was gone. It hadn't just ended tonight, it had ended months ago, maybe longer, eroded by secrets and lies I hadn't seen. My leaving wasn't the act that broke it, it was merely the acknowledgement of its death. There would be difficult days ahead, telling the children, dividing assets, dismantling a life built over 38 years. The prospect was daunting, exhausting, but the thought of going back, of trying to piece together the fragments of trust, felt even more impossible. Laura's apology, her tears, her plea to fix this, they rang hollow against the weight of her calculated actions. She hadn't made a mistake. She had made a choice, over and over again, for 8 months. And I had made mine in that hotel room by the sea. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the waking world. Cars were beginning to move on the highway below, people starting their days, oblivious to the wreckage of mine. The pain was still there, a deep throb beneath my ribs, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was the pain of surgery, perhaps, necessary to remove something that had become toxic. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't live in the past, couldn't live with the constant shadow of doubt. The road ahead was uncertain, lonely, but it was mine to walk. And strangely, in the midst of the heartbreak, that felt like the first honest thing I had felt in a long, long time. I showered, the hot water sluicing away the grime of the sleepless night, but doing little to ease the internal ache. Dressing felt like putting on armor for a battle I didn't want to fight. Looking in the cheap mirror above the dresser, I saw a man I barely recognized. Older, yes, but etched with a weariness that went beyond lack of sleep. It was the look of profound disillusionment. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over Chloe's contact again. Still too soon. Instead, I dialed the number for my solicitor's office, leaving a brief message requesting an appointment, my voice steadier than I expected. It was a small, practical step, but it felt significant, a move from passive grief to active separation. Gathering my few belongings, I paused at the door, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the corridor. The sterile quiet of the hotel felt less like emptiness now and more like a blank slate. Painful, yes, but also clean. The future was a terrifying void, but it was a void I would navigate on my own terms, free from the suffocating weight of lies. The scent of cinnamon was finally beginning to fade.